My name is Dave Emory, and it is my special privilege to be joined this evening by three eminent guests, all of them authors, all of them, in my opinion, also heroes. Three gentlemen who have taken it upon themselves to plumb the depths of untruth, to attempt to shed some light in some very dark corners of medical and political history, and three men to whom many members of the listening audience may wind up owing far more than they might suspect at first. First of all, it is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Alan Cantwell, the author of AIDS and the Doctors of Death, among other titles. Alan, welcome to our airwaves.
Thank you.
And if you could speak just a little louder and closer to the mic, please, Alan.
Okay, how's this?
Excellent. And Dr. Leonard Horowitz, the author of Emerging Viruses, subtitled AIDS and Ebola, Nature, Accident, or Intentional. Len, welcome to our airwaves.
Good evening, Dave.
And Ed Haslam, the author of Mary, Fairy, and the Monkey Virus, the story of an underground medical laboratory. Ed, welcome once again to our airwaves.
Thank you, Dave.
And, by the way, the publishers on these books, Emerging Viruses, published by Tetrahedron. We're going to tell you at the end of tonight's program where to get these books. AIDS and the Doctors of Death by Ares Rising Press, and Mary, Fairy, and the Monkey Virus by Wordsworth Press. Gentlemen, what I guess one could say in introducing all three of your books, books which have significant areas of convergence, a few areas of divergence, but all of which I think could be said to relate to a term that, Len, you coined in your book, Emerging Viruses, where you talked about the medical, military, industrial complex. And I think one of the factors that all of your books have in common is that you have determined that the reservoir, so to speak, of a number of diseases, ranging from, in your case, Ed, a soft tissue cancer epidemic and possibly AIDS. In your case, Len, AIDS and possibly Ebola and Marburg. And in your case, Alan Cantwell, AIDS. That the reservoir for all of these diseases lies in laboratories created by Homo sapiens. Basically, whether accident or intentional, and there is a debate and some divergence of opinion on all of these things, that these diseases were created intentionally and or otherwise in laboratories. Would you say that's a fair, common foundation for all of your works?
Yes, absolutely.
What I'm going to ask you to do next is to take about 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes, in that time frame, and sum up each of your books. Ed, in some ways, your book occurs first on a timeline. Why don't you begin?
Oh, I was hoping to go third.
You want? we can do that too.
You're in a hot seat, Ed.
Yeah.
Let's go.
No, we can do that. If you'd prefer to do that, we can do it.
Well, let me make a little bridge comment because I think I belong third in this sequence. But I mean, my story is a very narrow look at a very specific incident, and I think that's that underground medical laboratory that I've been investigating in New Orleans in the 1960s is a pivot point in a much larger story. And I think that Len Horowitz has done a terrific job of painting in the background of that from the perspective of the government's paper trail on what they've been doing in terms of medical research, or I hesitate to even call it medical research, but certainly biochemical and living organism research over the last number of years, and how it fits into the policy development apparatus of the United States. And Dr. Alan Cantwell has done a terrific job of just waking people up in terms of the devious activities of the scientific community. And I think those are really the broad brush things that we should start with. And once they have set the stage for that, I think it'll be a lot easier for people to see where this particular medical laboratory that I'm interested in fits in from a historical context.
Okay, fair enough. That is the way we will do it then. This is Democratic Radio, if nothing else. Which of the two of you would like to begin here? We need a leadoff hitter.
Well, we decided already that Alan should go first.
Okay, Alan?
Ares Rising Press, right? Ares always goes first.
Okay, by the way, it might seem a little corny to listeners, but this is one of the things that non-commercial radio allows you to do. This is over-the-counter radio. This is no BS radio.
Okay. Well, first of all, my obsession with the origin of AIDS stemmed from some research, particularly into the subject of Kaposi sarcoma, which is the so-called gay cancer, which turned out to be the scarlet letter of AIDS and allowed AIDS to be identified as a new and unique disease affecting young gay men in the early 1980s. And when the AIDS epidemic was uncovered in 1981, I had been studying this tumor and had found some bacteria and had published my research in the medical journals. And I thought it was rather strange that for the few years that we were awaiting the discovery of the cause of AIDS, that this work was ignored. So when the AIDS virus was discovered in April 1984 by Dr. Robert Gallo, the so-called discoverer of the AIDS virus, and as many of your listeners know, that was immediately challenged by Luc Montagnier of the Pasteur Institute, who felt that he was the discoverer of the AIDS virus. At any rate, I knew from the very beginning that the politics, particularly the scientific politics of AIDS, was very strange because there was absolutely no interest in my research, which did uncover an infectious agent, particularly in Kaposi sarcoma. I think that my obsession with AIDS reached its high mark in 1986 when I met Dr. Robert Strecker, who was one of the first American physicians to declare that AIDS was a man-made disease. And when I had the opportunity to meet him in the summer of 1986, one of my first questions to Dr. Robert Strecker was, okay, how did HIV, how did it become introduced into the gay community? And he quite simply told me, it's very simple, it was put there. And I said, it was put there? What are you talking about? And he said, well, you remember the hepatitis B vaccine experiment that began in New York City in 1978. And I said to him, well, I vaguely recall that. I'm a dermatologist. I don't get particularly involved with hepatitis. But he said, well, if you will go and you will study that experiment as well as study some other peculiarities about AIDS, you will, I think, come to the conclusion that AIDS is a man-made disease. Well, of course, this was very depressing, and I recall not sleeping very well that night and becoming very angry and determined to prove that Dr. Strecker was wrong. And so over a period of months of avid research into this area, as well as with the basis of my own work in cancer bacteria with Kaposi sarcoma and other forms of cancer, I did come to the conclusion that Dr. Strecker was correct, and my research, I wrote it up and tried to present it very simply, and it was incorporated into my book, AIDS and the Doctors of Death, which was published in 1988, and was a very successful book on some levels in that it was so successful in terms of upsetting people that when it was to be sold at a bookstore at the AIDS International Conference in Montreal in 1989, the World Health officials asked the booksellers very, very nicely but emphatically to please take that book off their shelves. So I realized then that this book was making a lot of waves and obviously upsetting the medical establishment. But the basis of the book tries to explain to people very clearly how HIV came out of cancer research, in particularly animal cancer research with animal viruses, which were taken from one animal and put into another animal, or taken from an animal cancer and then put into tissue cell cultures from various tissues of other animals, and then eventually into human tissue. And in the process of doing this, it is my contention that this gave birth to the AIDS virus. And of course, it's not only this kind of thinking, but an awareness of some of the documentation, for instance, the testimony before Congress in 1969, where the Department of Defense paid $10 million to develop what they called a super germ that was to be developed by the medical and biological institutions. And this super germ was to be used as a biological warfare agent, and it was to be a germ that had never before been known to occur in nature, but would be a germ that would be so powerful that the immune system of people would be powerless against. So it seemed to me that that virus, which was to be produced within a decade, actually was produced within a decade. And it seems to me that one representation of this supervirus could be the so-called HIV virus, which was introduced into the gay population in 1979. And the introduction of HIV into the gay population in 1979 followed very closely on the heels of the hepatitis B vaccine experiment. This vaccine experiment first took place in November 1978. It employed 1,000 gay men. The men in the experiment had to be gay. The experimenter did not want any straight men in the experiment. He wanted only promiscuous gay or bisexual men. He wanted men who were healthy. He wanted men who were well educated. He preferred white men, particularly men that had an address, a phone number, and that who could deposit blood over a period of time. So 1,000 men were finally selected. These were perfectly healthy men. And the injections began, and over the next year, the men received their injections. And then in 1980, new experiments began in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Denver, St. Louis, and Chicago. These were all done under the auspices of the CDC, the Public Health Service, the National Institute of Health, blah, blah, blah. And this was a very important vaccine experiment, which was very, very successful. And what happened is, a few months after the vaccine experiments began, the first few cases of AIDS started to trickle in New York City in 1979. All the men were gay, they were white, they were well educated, they were all previously healthy, so that you can clearly see that the profile of the men in the hepatitis B vaccine trial closely resembled the men who initially came down with AIDS as part of the epidemic. And the epidemic was quickly labeled a gay disease. Within a period of years, AIDS was, it was told to the American public that AIDS came from Africa. And I think most of your listeners, probably Dave, don't believe the green monkey story, and we've talked about that over this weekend repeatedly.
And we'll talk about it again later this evening.
Yeah, but certainly I would like to explain to your listeners that because I do not believe in the African origin of American AIDS at all, and I feel that that green monkey story was promoted by the government scientists who were intricately involved in the AIDS establishment, and that this story was perpetrated to put the blame on Africans and to cover up the real story about the origin of AIDS, which came out of animal cancer viral research. And Dr. Horowitz will go into that, I'm sure, in great detail. And I also want to say that, yes, I do believe that there's an AIDS epidemic in Africa, although there's some people who claim it doesn't exist there. And when you trace AIDS back in Africa, there is evidence that AIDS quickly followed as a result of massive vaccine programs sponsored by the World Health Organization, which injected millions of blacks as late as 1977. And as most people who are aware of vaccine experimentation know, especially black people, many vaccines are tested in Africa. And today at another meeting we talked about the story that appeared on the front page of the London Times on May 11th, 1987, where the science writer declared that a World Health official, World Health Organization health advisor had done a study, and he was convinced that the smallpox vaccine eradication program had something to do with a tremendous outbreak of AIDS in Africa, and that they had felt that the vaccine program had possibly awakened a dormant HIV virus, and that allowed HIV to come to the fore and to start the severe epidemic of AIDS in Africa. So, in summary, my books go into detail on cancer experimentation, and they go into detail as to the hepatitis B vaccine program. They go into detail about previous biological warfare experimentation, and certainly as time goes by, I think more and more people are aware that there are citizens throughout the world who secretly can be experimented on, and that includes not just black people and gay people, but white people. Certainly we become aware just a little bit of the radiation experiments that took place on unsuspecting American citizens starting in the 1940s into the 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, where we take a healthy young man and we inject him with plutonium, for instance, which is guaranteed, to kill people. So when I first started this work, people sort of went, "Oh, hum, I don't believe it" a bit. But now, I think as time goes by, we see more and more peculiarities in the science of AIDS, and that is because, in my view, the roots of AIDS stem from a cancer virus experimentation, an experimentation that was covert, and because the education of AIDS stems from roots that, as far as I'm concerned, are poisoned with biological warfare overtones. It seems to me now we are bearing the fruit of some really insane science, and tonight we'll be talking about things like the Persian Gulf syndrome, which is another thing that some people are totally convinced is a genetically engineered disease, either caused by the Iraqis or caused by us because we sold biological warfare weapons to Saddam Hussein, and he in turn delivered them to our soldiers. Or the other possibility is that our soldiers were all given experimental vaccines, sometimes forcibly against their will, and we will talk over and over again tonight about vaccine programs and how dangerous they can be in terms of if these vaccines are contaminated either accidentally or deliberately, that these can produce holocausts of unconceivable proportions. So with that, I think I will that's sort of a teaser for your listeners, but it sort of gives you my view as to why I believe that AIDS is a man-made disease and the research that went into that.
I would point out that your books came out in the 1980s, and that as a publisher on this subject, you were something of a pioneer, and this audience has become familiar with your work way back in the 80s, and some of your work was incorporated into supplements of an archive show I did that over in increments basically called AIDS, epidemic or weapon of war. And so you were, in a publishing sense, something of a pioneer and one of the individuals who walked point in terms of advancing what I believe is a valid, although certainly very controversial theory concerning AIDS. We might want to bear in mind, too, the ancient Turkish, or the old Turkish proverb that he who tells the truth gets chased out of 9 villages. And Dr. Cantwell, you deserve a lot of credit for being one of the first to be willing to be so chased. Who was it said, "Let me be chased, but not now"? And Len, you also have done work on cancer research, vaccines, and some of the things that have come out of them, possibly in unforeseen or possibly things that were deliberately created in a clandestine fashion.
Right. Well, I guess taking off where Alan left off, it was that Department of Defense appropriations request for 1970 funding for the sum of $10 million for a 5-year study to develop immune system ravaging viruses for germ warfare, which got me started on a 3-year investigation into the origin of AIDS and Ebola. And ultimately, it led me to the publication of Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, in which the readers will learn that was essentially Henry Kissinger's order to Melvin Laird when Kissinger took over as National Security Advisor under Richard Nixon in 1968. He almost immediately ordered Laird to do a reassessment of America's biological weapons capabilities. And when he then got the information, he selected the option of developing these immune system ravaging viruses. And this $10 million I ultimately tracked to an organization, very local, Dave, called Lytton Bionetics. which is a subsidiary of the mega military weapons contractor called Litton Industries. Now, interestingly enough, when Nixon was selecting Kissinger as NSC advisor, he was looking also at the possibility of selecting Roy Ashe, the president of Litton, for that post.
By the way, we might want to note that not only is Litton a major defense contractor, but has been a vehicle for covert actions in the past.
Interesting. Well, so what they did now, and how I fell into this, was the World Health Organization, as Alan had stated, was suspected by Dr. Gallo and others as being the route upon which the AIDS virus was developed and or deployed. So I began by investigating that theory by just going into World Health Organization Chronicle reports that I was able to dig up at Harvard's Cantwell Library. And I went through 1965 through 75 reviewing those reports, and I found that they had developed a viral research network that literally was able to isolate and or create over 70,000 viruses by 1970, and that they had used 4 principal agencies to distribute these viruses to well over 500 other research laboratories throughout the world. The 4 principal agencies included the Centers for Disease Control and the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda. And the NCI was actually the principal depository and principal distribution site. So at that point, I began to suspect Dr. Robert Gallo. Now, why would I do that? Well, I had heard all sorts of things. He's a notorious fellow who apparently had either discovered or co-discovered or allegedly stole the virus from Dr. Luc Montagnier, and I wasn't certain about him. I heard lots of things. I began to suspect him just because he was the chief retrovirologist associated with the National Cancer Institute. So I figured I'd better go into Harvard's Cantwell Library again and dig up Gallo's entire research reports, all of them from 1967 through 1974. There were about 40 some odd, and I buried myself in a room for about 3 weeks and didn't come out, and evaluated each and every paper several times. And what I learned was actually astonishing. What I learned was that they had taken monkey viruses, for example, that were completely humanly benign. They could barely hurt monkeys, and that they then recombined these with virtually every cancer virus under the sun. And in the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, I literally reprinted their entire list of viruses, and even the virologists that I showed this to at the International Conference on AIDS in Vancouver on July 10th, they couldn't believe it. It was just amazing, the recombinants. Well, at any rate, they had taken, for example, monkey viruses, recombined them with cat leukemia, chicken leukemia sarcoma. This caused immune suppression, wasting, and death. Feline leukemia virus, of course, many of your listeners can know this, that it caused a laundry list of symptoms virtually identical to what the AIDS patients suffer from. And then, even at this point, this virus could not infect humans. To get it to jump species, it needed another major mutation. And in order to accomplish that, what they did is they cultured it in human white blood cells in some studies and human fetal tissue cells in other studies so that it would literally adapt, creating the little proteins, the GP120-like proteins on the outside membrane of the AIDS virus that allows it to attach to the human cell membranes, be carried across the cell membranes, enter the gene of the cell, and then essentially do everything that the AIDS virus does. Now, I noticed that they published this, and I noticed that about 20%, maybe 30% of Gallo's reports he had published with co-authors from Litton Bionetics. And at the time, I didn't know what Litton Bionetics was. I kept looking around for some information about it, and ultimately I found in the congressional record that Litton Bionetics was 6th on the list of major Army biological weapons contractors at that time. And then I found a very interesting footnote in one of Dr. Gallo's papers with Bionetics researchers that they presented their research in front of NATO military scientists in Mol, Belgium. And so on July 10th, the evening that after I presented my paper, and I had the great honor to be the first researcher or investigator in the history of the International AIDS Conference to actually present a paper saying that these viruses are certainly man-made, the laboratory creations. And that night, I had gone to Dr. Gallo's open forum, and at that time in front of 300 people in the media, I asked Dr. Gallo, I was standing on a microphone, I said, Dr. Gallo, are you concerned at all that your early research might have led to the creation of the AIDS virus or its AIDS virus progenitors, and that through vaccine contamination from monkeys supplied by Lytton Bionetics researchers, your colleagues, which had been sent to Merck Sharp and Dohme, which were used to develop the experimental hepatitis B vaccine that was administered simultaneously in 1974 in Central Africa on blacks and on Willowbrook State School mentally retarded children on Staten Island in New York, as well as most plausibly gay men in New York City. And actually today we had some confirmation that indeed the gay men in New York were experimented on with that 1974 vaccine. Dave, you missed that this afternoon. We had that. We just learned that from
Different Light bookstore. And there was a fellow there that told Len about his experiences.
Yeah, it was very, very interesting. So up until this point, I only speculate. The speculation was based on a lot of circumstantial evidence, but we got confirmation of that this afternoon.
Fantastic.
Yes.
So we'll get into that in some of the subsequent discussion.
Right. So at any rate, Gallo flipped out. He got very angry with me. In essence, he told me that I need to go get a grade 101 level of biological science training, high school level, that it was impossible to do this work that I'm saying that he did. And meanwhile, we have the paper trail, and we have the documentation that proves it.
One thing we might want to note strictly for legal purposes is that Dr. Gallo has certainly not been charged with any kind of crime or faced with any kind of legal proceeding. Also, we should note that with regard to covert actions, because we're going to get into the institutions you've already been mentioning, such as Merck, Sharp and Dohme, Lytton, and so forth, heavily overlap the defense establishment. And again, the term I used earlier and that you coined in your book, the medical, military, industrial complex, I think is relevant. Frequently within the realm of national security research, people will do academic research simply in order to penetrate the realm of truth concerning the physical sciences, not knowing how their work will be used. And also, when you're talking about biological warfare, it doesn't take a great many people to transport or manipulate these things, given their size. And with regard to covert actions in general, all participants are dealt with on a need-to-know basis.
Exactly. So, at any rate, Dr. Gallo was very angry with me. The next day, he happened to see the fact that my co-author on emerging viruses, AIDS and Ebola, the fellow who wrote the foreword to the book, was John Martin, W. John Martin, MD, PhD, one of the world's leading vaccine contamination analysts, a personal friend of Dr. Gallo, who literally ran the FDA's Bureau of Biologics in charge of testing human vaccines between 1976 and 1980. And then he happened to see a testimonial that Garth Nicholson, one of your guests later on tonight, had given me, which basically said, I've contributed very well to science and to humanity for the publication of this book, and that he called Garth Nicholson because Nicholson was a good friend of his, and also they had both worked under the Special Virus Cancer Program and had some involvements with Fort Detrick. So he said to Nicholson something to the effect, and I guess Garth can tell you what he said more clearly, but the way it was relayed to me was that, what are you doing giving Horowitz a good testimonial like this? Obviously, the guy is like a lunatic, and what the heck are you doing? So Nicholson said something to the effect that, oh, well, first of all, he's no lunatic, he's a Harvard grad, and second of all, Bob, have you read his book? And he said, no. And he says, Bob, you better read his book. So here's his number. So on July 30th, my phone rings. He says, this is Gallo. And it started a 35-minute conversation wherein Dr. Gallo actually says he cannot argue in general with a thesis. And he however, raises 5 objections. Actually, there were only 2 major objections. One was the fact that he said that it was impossible, for example, to combine cat leukemia and chicken sarcoma viruses, that you can't do that, he says, because the homology was different. Meanwhile, that is absolutely false and totally misleading. In fact, A, he did it with his groups of researchers, and B, all his mentors actually came out and published that it was possible to do this research and that it was being done. And, in fact, the specific text that talks about biological weapons, the most definitive biological weapons text, published by Oxford University Press, contributed by David Baltimore, who was the principal pioneer in molecular genetics and molecular biology, he says, yes, indeed, this type of work was being done for biological weapons development between 1965 and 1975. And that's the second thing that Gallo says. He says, no, we couldn't have done it. And this is what your listeners are really, truly getting something tonight, right now, that they will not get anywhere else. The fact of the matter is they're going to hear time and time again that it's impossible for them to have produced the AIDS virus between 65 and 75 because Gallo said, no, we couldn't have done it because the molecular genetics engineering technology did not exist. Well, the truth is that Alexander Graham Bell did not need fiber optics to make his first telephone call. And the fact of the matter is that they were doing this in a very sloppy, haphazard manner. They were literally pulling together these different viruses, these different cancer viruses, and most incredibly, the specific cancer complex that they were focusing on between 1962 and 1976 during this special virus cancer program that Dr. Cantwell had talked about was the leukemia, lymphoma, sarcoma cancer complex that never existed in the human species, absolutely never existed until 1978 with the advent of AIDS, where we saw this cancer complex associated with the immune dysfunction. And that's exactly what they were producing in their labs at that time. Now, how do I know this? Ultimately, I dug up the contracts. At the end of the book Emerging Viruses, or close to the end of it, I found the contracts. It was an incredible experience. I wrote about how I found them. It was a miracle because they had been pulled off of the libraries. If you go into a library today and you put the subject title, book title, Special Virus Cancer Program, authors, NCI staff, nothing will come up. You'll get a blank title. The title will come up, but it'll show you there's not available. It's not available. They pulled it off the library catalogs, and I found it in the basement of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill Public Library. It was a public library, Davis Library, in the government's documents office, and that contained all of the people that were involved, what they were doing, their contracts, even their addresses and telephone numbers. And so that's where I found the contract under which AIDS-like and Ebola-like viruses were being developed by Litton Bionetics. I found the contract which showed that Litton Bionetics was the chief supplier of all the monkeys, all the monkey viruses, all the monkey virus cell lines and the reagents associated with every aspect of monkey virus cancer research and biological weapons development, and that ultimately I found that Litton Bionetics and Dr. Robert Gallo had been paid approximately $2,153,000 per year to develop these types of viruses. And that then answered my initial question: how was it that the National Academy of Sciences knew to tell the Department of Defense in 1968 that it would take 5 years at $2 million a year for the development of these immune system ravaging viruses for germ warfare? Was the fact that they had just done it.
There are a number of institutions, before we move on to Ed Haslam, by way of setting the stage for examining the vaccines, contamination of vaccines, and either unintentional or intentional dissemination of some of these diseases. The war on cancer that Richard Nixon declared, Litton Bionetics, Fort Detrick, the Special Viral Cancer Program, Jack Gruber, and Alfred Hellman, names that all overlap each other, the National Cancer Institute, and biological warfare.
Yes, indeed. I mean, those were the key players. Jack Gruber, on this contract we published in Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola, you see Dr. Gruber and Dr. Gallo were the NCI project officers on the Litton Bionetics research grant. And as you say, Jack Gruber's background is in Fort Detrick in biological weapons development and also at the NCI. You had Litton Bionetics connections both at Fort Detrick. Interestingly enough, their principal research laboratory was also in northwest Uganda, associated with the International Association for Research in Cancer. And I also tracked the most plausible vaccine in which AIDS viruses were initially transmitted to the 1974 experimental hepatitis B vaccine that was conducted simultaneously in New York City and Central Africa. And for those listeners out there who read The Hot Zone, Richard Preston's The Hot Zone, where Preston said that these viruses emerged out of Kidham Cave near northwest Uganda. Well, Kidham Cave, it turns out, is a metaphor for Litton Bionetics research laboratories, which was about 250 miles south of the actual Kidham Cave.
And Fort Detrick, well, maybe we should get into this a little later on in the discussion about how Fort Detrick figures in here. By the way, Alan, a couple of points, too. If you could help me remember later, because we're going to be ranging far and wide in this discussion, two of the points that I want to make sure to bring up about AIDS and the Doctors of Death. A very important individual, Wolf Schmunes, an individual who appears to have more connections than a switchboard. Also, Alan, you bring up the Tuskegee study, something that I think in terms of historical antecedents is important here, and something that also has a hard operational connection. Ed, you've been waiting patiently there, and you wanted to bat third, so we've got 2 men on and nobody out, and it's your turn to step to the plate. And again, if you could summarize the book, and then we'll range far and wide here and examine areas of overlap and divergence and convergence, and maybe where we go from here.
Well, first of all, let me say I question the wisdom of my decision to bat third, because I had to sit here and listen to all that, and every time somebody said something, I had a comment I wanted to make, and I pretty much agreed with the vast majority of what I heard there. I want to start with a couple comments, and then I'll get into my book. First of all, both authors talked about the 1970 congressional testimony by Dr. MacArthur, and I really agree with Dr. Horowitz's analysis that statement was made after the work had already been done. And if it started the decade of work, I just wonder which decade of work it was. Secondly, I think the arguments that AIDS is a man-made disease is a very good argument. I address it in my book, and I address it more on the work of Los Alamos Laboratories, where they measure the intrinsic error frequency rate of it using certain sophisticated genetic techniques, etc. But the arguments that it's man-made is a very serious scientific position, and I think it's a very reasonable position. How it was man-made is a different issue, and I think we can talk about it later. My story kind of traces back to the fact that I'm from New Orleans, and during that entire time I grew up, I kept hearing very strange rumors about a lot of strange stuff that was going on in town, and particularly people that were doing bizarre experiments with monkey viruses. And I was concerned about these experiments back in the 1960s. And in the late 1980s, when the mainstream American scientists, such as Max Essex out of Harvard, etc., started talking about HIV-1, or the AIDS virus, being a mutated monkey virus, it sounded awfully familiar to me, because it sounded like the work I'd heard about in New Orleans back in the 1960s. But I decided to ask a very basic question. If you have a brand new global epidemic that nobody's ever seen before, and they're telling you that it's caused by a mutated monkey virus, then the obvious logical question is, who was mutating monkey viruses and why? And what is characteristic of this whole discussion of AIDS is just massive amounts of misinformation, much of which is ridiculous. I mean, when this monkey virus thing came up, instead of the press saying, okay, let's get the list of people who were doing monkey virus research, particularly working in the area of with ingredients that could cause mutations, and start interviewing them concerning the activities that were going on, and see if we can come to an answer to this. What we got instead were these ridiculous comments about people, the kinky sex theory, and people having sex with monkeys in Africa and stuff as some possible cause of this thing. And that just shows how far off the conversation. We're talking about non-commercial radio. I mean, it's why you need an alternate channel of information, so that you can ask the questions: who was mutating monkey viruses and why? And get into this whole history of the development of genetic recombination and the activities that happened before genetic recombination, which led to its development, because it didn't just happen overnight. And there's a reason that the whole study of genetic recombination emerged from the study of a monkey virus, particularly the SV40 virus, which was indigenous to the Asian macaques. Now, what I did is my book is really an investigation into the murder of a cancer researcher that occurred 30 years ago. And it was to my great surprise that that investigation led me to a very startling understanding about a cancer epidemic that we're having in the United States today. And the dimensions of this cancer epidemic is just staggering. I mean, it's 4 cancers, first of all. They're all soft tissue cancers. We're talking about breast cancer, prostate cancer, lymphoma, and melanoma of the skin. And they're there's about 500,000 cases a day, and it's costing us about $250 million a day of medical insurance premiums just to take care of the clinical treatment of this, plus, of course, an absolute fortune in human suffering. Now, my investigation initially started investigating this claim that this murdered cancer researcher had been involved with a violent political extremist and had been doing some sort of bizarre viral cancer research in an underground laboratory hidden in a residential neighborhood. And the final outcome of my investigation in this thing has come to the fact that the death of this woman was not a psychosexual slashing as it had been presented to the public, but actually she died in some form of industrial accident involving a machine which produced radiation, which was being used in these monkey virus experiments in New Orleans. And so what my book is an investigation into this whole environment and to these people. And when you talk about names like Fort Detrick, and you talk about the history of biological warfare development, and you go back in the 1940s, 1950s, the people involved in this laboratory in New Orleans in the 1960s are people that have paper trails all the way back there, who have long histories of secret government operations, who have personal contacts with not only the people in the power structure, but they have personal stories about their family members and stuff that have been consumed by these diseases. And particularly, we investigated a document that was found in the apartment of this violent political extremist that everybody had said he wrote. Well, I looked for it for a year and a half and finally found it in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and did a very detailed analysis of this document and figured out who wrote this document, who had to write it.
This is David Ferry.
Yeah. Ed, if I could ask you just, Ed, you were talking about a cancer researcher who died in a mysterious accident, and also who actually was murdered, though she was finished off in terms of murder, and also a violent political extremist. I think we might want to name these two protagonists at this point.
Okay. The cancer researcher was Dr. Mary Sherman. She was a professor at Tulane Medical School. She ran a cancer laboratory at the Ochsner Clinic. She was a graduate of the University of Chicago Medical School. She was an orthopedic surgeon by training, and she held one of the most prestigious positions in orthopedic surgery in the country. That is, that she was the chairman or chairperson of the pathology committee of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, which is their elite professional organization. David Ferry, by contrast, is someone who lived on the fringes of society. He had been an airline pilot during his respectable days. He lost his job in that through some decency charges due to some relationships he had with underage boys. And his life sort of fell into a spiral, and he started working for the CIA, training pilots for the Bay of Pigs invasions, flying covert missions, flying mafia boss Carlos Marcello around, doing private investigation work for Carlos Marcello and for Guy Bannister, and eventually became one of the suspects in the assassination of President Kennedy, according to the investigation conducted in New Orleans by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. Those are the main players in the book, but actually the real main player in the book is Dr. Alton Ochsner, who was Mary Sherman's boss, because he is the one that was cleared for all the secret government experiments and had been working for the U.S. military on medical-related matters all the way back to the 1940s and had received numerous citations from that. So kind of the key points of my book are, one, we discovered that there was a secret U.S. government laboratory in New Orleans, and that laboratory was on U.S. government property. It was using a radioactive device known as a linear particle accelerator, which accelerates subatomic particles and shoots them into whatever object they choose to. That this research traced back to earlier events involving the contamination of the polio vaccine with a cancer-causing virus, which I personally believe today is related to the current epidemic of soft tissue cancers that we're experiencing, that the objective of that laboratory was a desperate attempt to develop a vaccine to prevent the current epidemic of cancer, and the technique they used there was irradiating monkey viruses for that. In 1964, Mary Sherman died a bizarre and terrible death, and that laboratory, I believe, was shut down at that point, and I think it's very interesting that I hear dates like 1965 from Dr. Horowitz, because that is exactly when I think this research that they were doing in this underground medical laboratory was turned over to the biowarfare researchers for them to continue. The real tragedy of this thing is that when that occurred, there were several thousand mice that were involved in this laboratory in New Orleans, and those mice were turned over and left in the hands of David Ferry, who is a man with a very unstable mental profile, with a long history of violent political activities, particularly towards targets in the Caribbean, such as Cuba and Haiti.
By the way, Ed, two things we might want to mention. One is what they were doing with those mice, and also you mentioned the name Guy Bannister, which is central, I think, to the political milieu that we're talking about.
Well, New Orleans is the northern part of the Caribbean, and it's a critical city in terms of both intelligence operations and military strategy and political resources in the United States, and was the center of a lot of anti-communist activity towards both Cuba and other countries in Central and Latin America. And Guy Bannister was a former FBI, not just an FBI agent, but he was actually the head of the FBI office in Chicago, and he moved down to New Orleans to become a private investigator, though he was the number 3 man over at the police department for a couple of years until he got canned from that. And Guy Bannister is very involved in Garrison's investigation into the assassination of Kennedy, and many, many people have given very reliable testimony that he was personally associated with Lee Harvey Oswald, as was David Ferry. And the activities that were going on in New Orleans had much to do with the covert war against Cuba, and many of these off-the-books operations and many blind bank accounts which were going on. And again, this thing with MacArthur in 1970, I think it's very interesting that they put a date so that they can say, no, we weren't doing this before this. And I think there was 10 years of activity on this project prior to 1970.
The point I wanted to emphasize, Ed, is that in the person of Guy Bannister, an individual who you speculate in your book may have been the person under the auspices of whom this laboratory may have been run, appears to have been functioning as a cutout for the intelligence community. So again, we're back to the national security establishment looming in the background here. Len Horowitz talked about a number of institutions overlapping national security, figuring in the background again of vaccines, viral vaccine contaminants, and disease caused by them, either intentional or otherwise. And for those who may have sat back in the late 1980s and said of Dr. Alan Cantwell and the other publishing pioneers in this field, well, they're full of beans, show me the connections there, who would do that, why, and how. I think the contexts in which both you and Len Horowitz have presented your information, as well as Alan Cantwell, certainly set the stage for asking and answering these questions. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, thanks for those comments. A point that comes to mind, I'm sure all three of us are familiar with a book written by Mirko Grmek in France called The Origin of AIDS, where he goes through a lot of AIDS theories, and he kind of throws this one on the sofa and that one out the window as he goes through. But there's one theory which is proposed to him about radiation mutating monkey viruses in Africa, and this theory proposes that it's a fallout from French nuclear tests. And Grmek snarls at this theory and says, well, without somebody giving us more specific information about precisely this and precisely that, it's difficult to take this theory seriously. And the point I want to make is, on 210 State Street in New Orleans, at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, there was a linear particle accelerator emitting radiation targeted at monkey viruses. Okay, is that specific enough?
Yeah, you know what else, Ed? Is one little point that I dug up, that Luc Montagnier, the discoverer of the AIDS virus along with Dr. Gallo, was France's director of nuclear medicine during the 1960s. And what specifically he was doing was exactly what you're saying. What happened in New Orleans, what he was doing was the same thing in France. He was bombarding monkey viruses and various different viruses and tissues with radiation to mutate the viruses, mutate the tissues, and then he studied the external membrane characteristics of the viruses to determine what kinds of mutations were necessary to get these to cause cancers in humans and other animals.
By way of setting the context, too, Ed, down in New Orleans, Alton Ochsner as a political and medical animal, Mary Sherman, Inca, and Lee Harvey Oswald, all of it in 25 words or less.
It was Dr. Ochsner's job to portray Lee Harvey Oswald as a communist in the press prior to the assassination. How many was that?
Well, that's a nice start. Of course, I was being facetious, but again, by way of setting the context in which this research, because again, we've got Mary Sherman, one of the foremost cancer researchers in the country, working with a milieu which appears to have been involved in the assassination of President Kennedy, but which also involves a very important, though generally not recognized individual, Dr. Alton Ochsner or Ochsner, who is not only a very important political animal, but a very important medical animal and a person with more connections than a switchboard, a lot of those to the national security establishment.
Well, let me just say a couple of things about Ochsner, just to kind of tune everybody into him. Remember Cordell Hull? He was U.S. Secretary of State during World War II under FDR. Well, he picked up the telephone and personally called Alton Ochsner to get him to get on a plane and fly to Panama to take care of the dictator of Panama, who was about dead, because we owed that dictator a favor for helping us throw the Nazis out of the country so that the Germans couldn't get a hold of the Panama Canal. All right? Point one?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Point two, Richard Nixon. You remember the war on cancer and stuff? He comes to New Orleans in the 1960s after losing the California gubernatorial race. And who does he have lunch with? He has lunch with Alton Ochsner. Okay, when Alton Ochsner's wife is having problems with her passport and the State Department won't obey what they're being told in order to fix her passport in time for her to go to the Greek Isles, she calls the White House and asks to speak to Dick. Okay? These people are as wired into the power establishment as anybody could possibly be. When Alton Ochsner wants to build his new hospital, he needs a lot of money for seed money. He needs a lot of money to build the hospital. Who gives him what was then $750,000, but what would be today about $7.5 million, but Clint Murchison? That's the seed money he uses, and where does he get the rest of the money to build his hospital? The United States government gives it to him. Meanwhile, he's working in a sensitive position for the United States government on undisclosed things. Undisclosed, that is, he previously worked for the War Department, for the Navy, for the Air Force, for the Army, and for the FBI. Now he's working on an undisclosed assignment.
By the way, Clint Murchison's name also crops up frequently in the context of the investigation into President Kennedy's assassination. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, and it should. At any rate, Ochsner is an incredibly powerful medical figure. He really is one of the people that helped shape American medicine today. If you're not familiar with the Ochsner Clinic in New Orleans, about the size of the Mayo Clinic up in Minnesota, and his role in founding this organization called Inca is really interesting, because this is an anti-communist propaganda mill, basically. And when Lee Harvey Oswald comes to New Orleans, there's a number of media events that occur. One is a TV station sends a camera crew out. That's WDSU TV. They're owned by Edgar Stern, and Edgar Stern is one of the core members of Alton Ochsner's Inca.
By the way, Inca stands for?
The Information Council for the Americas, which was basically, they recorded things like interviews with Cuban exiles and refugees about the horrors of losing their mattress factories and sugar plantations to Castro, and then sent these tapes out to other countries around Latin America to try to help them fight off communism. I don't know that any radio station in any other country ever played any of their stuff, but they had a list of about 125 radio stations that they sent things out to. But the point is, when they get Lee Harvey Oswald onto the radio station during a live broadcast, and the radio station again is owned by Edgar Stern from Inca, they get somebody to debate Oswald, who pulls a piece of paper out of his pocket and starts talking about his defection to the Soviet Union. Well, this person that does this is the executive director of Inca. He's the only employee Inca has. So he's really the mouthpiece for Alton Ochsner in the first place. And then they take this half-hour radio interview and they make a phonographic record out of it, and using money from a industrialist from California by the name of Farley, they send it to 300 radio and TV stations all across the country. But before they do that, they run over to Hale Boggs, who's about to be appointed to the Warren Commission, and they play the tape for him so that Boggs can hear that Oswald said, "Yes, I am a Marxist." Okay? And then Boggs picks up the telephone and calls Lyndon Johnson and tells him that he's just heard that, this boy Oswald's a communist. And then, after knowing what Boggs' position is on this thing, LBJ turns around and puts Boggs on the Warren Commission. So, and all this is the activity that's being coordinated by Dr. Ochsner down in New Orleans. So this is it's deep politics, guys. I mean, this is national power, people who are in a position to influence who's in the White House, people are capable of influencing what the National Institute of Health does, etc. Now, the real connection between Ochsner and these other activities involving the vaccines is that Ochsner was very much involved with the drug companies and was very pro the polio vaccine. I'm talking about the Salk vaccine, the first one that came out. And there were a lot of debates about this. And in fact, one of the women that I talk about a lot in my book is Bernice Eddy. She safety tested vaccines for the NIH, and she flunked the Salk vaccine. She found it paralyzed and killed her monkeys and told NIH not to release it. And a big debate erupted about whether, a private debate in the corridors of power about whether to do this. And Alton Ochsner said, "This thing is safe. I will prove it to you. I will give it to my grandchildren." And he did. And he gave this polio vaccine to his grandchildren, and he killed his grandson and crippled his granddaughter by doing it. So he had a very strong personal connection to the whole development of the polio vaccine. And so when they needed somebody to try to run an underground laboratory in order to develop a vaccine to try to prevent this epidemic of cancer that they later found out looked like it was coming down the road, he was a very good choice.
Now, Alton Ochsner and Mary Sherman, the monkey viruses and the contamination of the polio vaccine, because we've been talking in the context of the contamination of vaccines, cancer research, and AIDS. And you speculated that, in fact, the work that Mary Sherman, who was closely associated with Alton Ochsner, again, we're setting the political milieu, that's the context in which these events took place. You were speculating that the contamination, you have speculated, that the contamination of the polio vaccine and the work that Mary Sherman was doing with Alton Ochsner, possibly David Ferrie, and possibly under the auspices of Guy Banner, was related to that.
Well, I definitely think the work that Mary Sherman was doing was connected with Alton Ochsner and was connected to the contamination of the polio vaccine, and I do think that their objective was trying to develop a vaccine to prevent the epidemic of cancer that we have today. Now, with having just said that, you can't do that type of stuff using a linear particle accelerator in secret, using secret government money without some oversight from somebody, and that oversight came from the U.S. military. And we have identified actual people that had no business being in New Orleans that were military bioweapons people that happened to show up in New Orleans right when this laboratory was getting started. And I think one of my big concerns about this whole thing is, regardless of how noble the objectives were for starting this thing, once the work got started, there were people standing around looking over their shoulders and say, we can use that as a weapon.
there are so many things with regard to each of these gentlemen's works that we could talk about, and unfortunately time is not going to await any of us. What I'd like to do here perhaps is to throw out some institutions and points of commonality and let each of you comment and sort of involve yourselves in the discussion as you see fit on some of these subjects. Now, we were talking about the Special Cancer Virus Research Program and Fort Detrick. We should note that Fort Detrick was taken over by Lytton Bionetics and was run for the National Cancer Institute. And, of course, Leonard Horowitz has already talked about the name Robert Gallo, and there are a couple of other people who we should mention in connection with that, and those are, again, Jack Gruber and Alfred Hellman, who maintained the cell culture laboratory for the Special Viral Cancer Research Program. It was maintained, interestingly enough, at the Naval Biosciences Laboratory right here in Oakland, California, a military facility, and Jack Gruber and Alfred Hellman were longtime veterans of Fort Detrick. Ed, in New Orleans, there's a very important monkey research facility called the Delta Primate Center. Is that correct?
Yes, that is.
And there's an interesting fellow who showed up there about 1971 with a background similar to Gruber and Hellman.
Yeah, the Delta Regional Primate Center is technically owned by the United States government, in particular by the National Institute of Health, but it is managed by Tulane University, with the understanding that about half of the work that goes on in there will be done by LSU, so it's a joint management program. And the history of that thing goes back into psychological research, but the guy that came down in 1973 was Peter Jerome, and his whole background was on basically the aerosol contamination of cancer-causing viruses for the U.S. military. And he was deeply involved in all these retrovirus research. And in fact, one of the things that came up earlier, you start talking about the nuclear stuff, the Defense Nuclear Agency, one of the meetings that we have evidence that he was at was with the Defense Nuclear Agency talking about the hazards of biologically contaminated simians and what dangers they pose and how you contain them from a quarantine point of view, and then how you deal with emergencies and stuff. So this whole situation of Tulane, the monkey virus research in Tulane did not start by any means in 1964 when they built the Regional Primate Center, and it did not start in 1973 with Peter Jerome. It goes back way before that. And they were also doing a lot of other neurological research down there with CIA money about mind control and stuff, which is, I don't want to get too far off in that direction. But this whole thing of monkey virus research, I mean, we're talking about there's 40, 50 years of research going on here in the United States with people messing around with the genetic structures of these things. I don't think it's remarkable once you understand that history that we happen to have a new global epidemic caused by mutated monkey virus, if in fact that's what it's even caused by.
Drs. Horowitz and Cantwell, the hepatitis B vaccine and Merck Sharp and Dome.
Well, okay. You wanted to talk about Dr. Schmunis. I think this is a very strange story, kind of like Harvey Oswald. Here you had basically a Polish Jew who was a medical student in Poland when the Nazis invaded, partitioned Poland. His family in the western part of Poland were all exterminated in the Holocaust. He was taken to Siberia by the Russians. After the war, and apparently during his imprisonment, he was beaten and told things by the KGB that, you will do what you're told, and if you don't, we will find you, blah, blah, blah. This is the story that has been incorporated in some of the medical journals. After the war, he married a Russian woman, finished medical school in Tomsk in central Russia. In the early 50s, they allowed him to go back to Poland. He had an interest in hepatitis after his wife, Maya, developed hepatitis. He became an epidemiologist. During his tour of duty on a rest period, he happened to end up at one of those rest programs, and his roommate happened to end up being a Polish priest who eventually became the current Pope John Paul. There are conflicting stories as to how he ended up in America. One story is that he was at a meeting in Italy and he defected with his wife and child to America. The other story is that there was an anti-Semitic purge in the 60s in Poland, and he was persecuted and he was allowed out. At any rate, he came to New York with his family, penniless, the story is, with $15 in his pocket. He went to the library at, I believe, Cornell. Somebody called his name over a loudspeaker. He got a job as a lab assistant at the New York City Blood Center. Within a few years, he was named chief of the Blood Center and continued his hepatitis studies. He rapidly became professor of epidemiology at Columbia University. In the mid-'70s, he was invited back to Moscow to give a speech. He was scared to death to go back to Moscow. You can imagine why. But through contacts at the State Department, he was allowed back. He gave his lecture. They heralded him. He went back and proceeded to get ready for the greatest experiment of his life, which was the hepatitis B vaccine trial, which turned out to be tremendously successful. It was like 96% successful in supposedly immunizing promiscuous gay men against hepatitis B. And the following year, he conveniently died of lung cancer. There's very, very little written about him. I mean, in terms of if you would think that somebody of that stature would die, there would be some kind of article about his life, but there has been very, very little written. In one of my later books, Queer Blood, I just like to talk, even though this man has sort of been eradicated from the medical annals, I suppose the government does not want anybody really remembering the hepatitis B trial, especially with people like myself and Len talking about the distinct possibility that this was the introduction of the AIDS virus into the gay community. But at any rate, I wrote in my book, Queer Blood, a couple of paragraphs that I'd like to read because I think it brings together some of this Twilight Zone stuff that we are talking about. I wrote, although Smoothness's death received no fanfare, he was remembered and honored by a small coterie of distinguished scientists. The national and international medical power brokers who run medical science and who represent the media darlings. Those who paid tribute to Schmooness include the top government scientists in AIDS and cancer, the two discoverers of the AIDS virus, the most well-known researchers in animal experimentation, the heads of the most prestigious biomedical establishments in the nation, and the chief executives of drug companies tied to genetic engineering, vaccine production, and biological warfare research. On May 11th, 1984, a landmark meeting took place in the nation's capital to honor Wolf Schmooness. One of the most distinguished attendees was Dr. Robert Gallo, who had announced the discovery of the AIDS virus 3 weeks earlier. Looking over the list of contributors and participants at this remarkable symposium sponsored by the American Red Cross, I wondered what had really brought all these powerful people together to pay homage to Wolf Schmooness. I had lived long enough to recognize the truth contained in the adage, birds of a feather do indeed flock together. There was a strange and ominous connection between cancer and AIDS, between animal experimentation and genetic engineering of viruses, between biologic warfare technology and drug companies, between gay experiments and AIDS, between vaccine programs and the contamination of the nation's blood supply. Why else would all these people from diverse areas of science be attending this high-level conference? And of course, despite the denial of the medical authorities regarding the AIDS association with the vaccine, there was a connection between Schmooness's gay experiment and the outbreak of AIDS in American cities. It was not my imagination, and it wasn't a coincidence. The more I studied the hepatitis B experiment, the more the connections to biological warfare and genocide became apparent.
I want to get into some of the connections of Merck and Company and the vaccine. One of the points that I wanted to make about Schmooness, and something you point out in your book, AIDS and the Doctors of Death, and is far removed and as crazy as it might seem to some people to talk about Wolf Schmunus and Lee Harvey Oswald in the same breath. I think there's some very important similarities in the way the two, perhaps to use a biological metaphor, were able to cross the very formidable Iron Curtain as though it were sort of a semi-permeable cell membrane. The suggestions with both people, and again I'm telescoping in the interests of time, is that both probably had connections to intelligence services. Lee Harvey Oswald was officially a communist. Ed and Inca helped to portray Lee Harvey Oswald as a communist. The spin on Wolf Schmunus has been as a refugee of Soviet oppression, which he may very well have been. He also spent much of his formative years, including some of his medical training, though, as a Jew surviving in Nazi-occupied Poland, which was no mean feat. He was a roommate of Karol Wojtyla, who, again, making a very long story very short, is an individual with known intelligence connections, an individual who participated in the closing phase of the Cold War with our intelligence services, close to the P2, the fascist P2 Lodge in Italy, close to the Opus Dei lay Vatican order, which helped elevate his rise to the Vatican, that very close to Francisco Franco and its regime. And again, the Pope himself, a very interesting political animal. But the way that Schmunus was able to move with his whole family across the Iron Curtain and go from the Soviet Union right to the United States, where he immediately
went to the top.
He sort of experienced a genetic mutation that in a professional sense, which elevated him right to the top of the field of medical research that he was in, is not unlike the way Lee Harvey Oswald, who had supposedly defected to the Soviet Union with top-secret information about our radar nets and the U-2, then goes back to the United States, is never prosecuted, is then being handled by a milieu not unlike the milieu that we're looking at here, people like that, or institutions like the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, Inca, the Anti-Communist League of the Caribbean, two of those three institutions affiliated with the World Anti-Communist League, appear in the background and also in the foreground of Lee Harvey Oswald, the supposed communist. So again, as weird as it might seem, I think Wolf Schmunus and Lee Harvey Oswald may very well be similar political animals in terms of their genesis. Now, going back again to the hepatitis B vaccine, that was administered by a very interesting company, Merck Sharp and Dohme. Len, if you could tell us about that company and also about a couple of institutions which figure in the Hep B research, the Hep B vaccine research, Saul Krugman, the New York University Medical Center, and Maurice Hilleman as well of Merck Sharp and Dohme.
Sure. Well, Merck Sharp and Dohme, first of all, the president of Merck was George W. Merck, who was America's biological weapons industry director, personally appointed by President Roosevelt after the Second World War. And what I was able to do was track the vaccine, the contaminated vaccine, to the monkeys that were shipped to Merck by Lytton Bionetics, the biological weapons contractors that created numerous AIDS-like and Ebola-like viruses. And that what they did, what it's actually Hilleman did, was he imported African green monkeys and other monkeys for cancer virus and vaccine research. And that these researchers themselves, now when I say these researchers, I'm talking about Hilleman, and I'm talking about Guerin and Poitz and Purcell. All of these researchers had actually discussed at length the fact that they had a major biohazard and containment problem. All of their monkeys were contaminated, they said. For example, they said that 70% of their monkeys were contaminated with hepatitis B virus environmentally and a whole assortment of other viruses. So now it's interesting that they use these types of monkeys to grow, according to Robert Purcell at the National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, who had a major hand in the development of this most plausible vaccine that spread AIDS to the world. Purcell said that they grew the experimental hepatitis B virus at Merck Sharp and Dohme's facilities and the New York University Medical Center facilities in New York, which is associated with the New York City Blood Bank. And we'll have to make sure you remind me to get into the Rockefeller connections to this institution.
And by the way, we should note here, again, that Merck Company is one of the major names involved with the U.S. Biological Warfare Research Program. So this is the vaccine manufacturer we're talking about. New York University Medical Center is also a major recipient of biological warfare research contracts and is involved in this research.
Exactly. So that now they brought these monkeys in, they were contaminated, they then used these chimps and monkeys, contaminated monkeys and chimps, to grow the hepatitis B virus, which they then inoculated into Willowbrook State School mentally retarded children on Staten Island in New York, and gay men in New York City, and blacks in Central Africa to develop the different subtypes of the hepatitis B vaccine that they were going to be producing. Now, who was involved in this specifically was the Food and Drug Administration, the Merck Sharp and Dohme, the Centers for Disease Control, and the National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases. Now, see if you can follow me on this. Once they had the hepatitis B viruses grown in the chimps in now to the human subjects, they then thus infected the humans with these viruses. They then withdrew from these people the serum with which they made the experimental hepatitis B vaccine, which was subsequently administered to 200,000 human subjects simultaneously in New York City and Central Africa in 1974. And as Ed Haslam has already told you, the polio vaccine had been administered to these same people approximately 10 years earlier, and that alone contained SV40, the 40th simian monkey virus ever discovered. It had simian foamy retroviruses, which are RNA reverse transcriptase retroviruses, highly mutatable. It had herpes-type viruses, cytomegaloviruses, Epstein-Barr viruses. In other words, these individuals that they used to make this vaccine were themselves fully contaminated. This was an accident waiting to happen. They then recombined. All of these different viruses were literally recombining in these human subjects from which they made that experimental hepatitis B vaccine, which Dr. Cantwell has very clearly stated was absolutely associated with the outbreaks among the gay population in the United States, and most clearly, in my opinion, the blacks in Central Africa, too.
I want to get into some of the recombinant, or using human beings as sort of a, what was the term you used? A repository in which these various viruses could recombine. A couple of interesting names, though, sticking with the hepatitis B and also in the New York City area, because there's some other points I want to touch on. Maurice Hilleman, the top researcher for Merck Sharp and Dohme, also himself deeply involved with military research.
Yes, indeed.
Dave?
Yeah.
This is Ed. May I add a footnote to what Len was just talking about in Africa?
Sure, go ahead.
Because what they did in Africa, and there was a lot of crossover between Africa and the Caribbean, okay? But what they did there, then they followed with other doctors who went down there and bought blood from these people. And they took that blood from those third world people who they had been putting all these vaccines into. Then they flew it back to the United States and used it to make gamma globulin, which they then turned around and injected into the American population, mostly the homosexual population.
Right, and they, when you say they, it was specifically Lawrence Rockefeller, the New York City Blood Council, which was the council of doctors that Lawrence Rockefeller put together, which formed the New York City Blood Bank, and this was the International Blood Bankers. So the they has a name.
And let's talk about ground zero at blood banks for a minute. Everybody thinks about the Swiss Red Cross as ground zero. The person that brought blood typing to Switzerland, which made the blood banks possible, was Dr. Alton Oshner.
Interesting.
And, now, again, Maurice Hilleman, though, the top Hep B researcher for Merck Sharp and Dohme, is an individual who's working for the OSRC, a top Pentagon outfit.
Exactly. And what's absolutely incredible, in the last chapter of Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola, it's called Smoking Guns and Conclusions. I was able to actually get a hold of a tape, an audio-taped interview with Dr. Maurice Hilleman, the world's leading vaccine developer for both the military as well as Merck Sharp and Dohme. On tape at the National Library of Medicine is recorded an interview with Dr. Hilleman, in which he says, in 1986, we brought the AIDS virus into North America in contaminated African greens. We didn't know it at the time, he said. And this was an interview by Edward Shorter, Harvard medical historian, and it was captured live on tape in Boston on WGBH radio, and actually there was a film crew there, which was the Boston's premier public television broadcasting station, and they never aired it.
One thing, too, I wanted to touch on. Now, Alan, you cited in AIDS and the Doctors of Death some very compelling statistics that indicated that, once again, the hepatitis B vaccine was the cause of AIDS. In other words, that a lot of the people who participated in this turned up with AIDS. I want you to touch on that point. And then, Len, as this information that Alan is discussing began to come to light, a very interesting study by the aforementioned Dr. Poitz came out saying, oh, this is just a bunch of nonsense. Dr. Poitz turned out to be a very interesting individual, not at all an objective observer in the phenomena we're talking about. First Dr. Cantwell, then Dr. Horowitz.
Well, the gay men that were part of the experiment had to deposit blood every 3 months, 6 months, what have you. And it was interesting because Dr. Shmunis said at the end of the experiment, when they wanted to dump all this blood that they had, he said, don't dump this blood because there may be diseases coming down the line and we may need this blood. So that all the blood that was deposited by gay men in this experiment was retained by the New York City Blood Center. Now, in 1985, when a test was devised to test for HIV, they naturally then went back to determine whether those blood tests, when those blood tests became positive for HIV. Through a lot of blood testing, they came to the conclusion that HIV had to be introduced into the American blood supply somewhere around 1978, 1979. Now, the interesting thing to me, a tremendous statistic, which to me is very, very strong evidence that the hepatitis B vaccine trial is intimately associated with the introduction of HIV into the gay community, was that the blood from 1980. Now, that means that 1 year prior to even discovering the AIDS epidemic, which was discovered in June of 1981, in 1980, 20% of the men who had volunteered for that experiment, 20% of the men were already positive for HIV, which indicates to me that they had the highest percentage of HIV infection of any population on the planet, and that includes any African population. Also interesting that I think some of your listeners will remember that tale out of Randy Schilte's book, The Band Played On, which came out in 1987, where he talked about Patient Zero, the Canadian airline pilot that flew in from Paris and was terribly promiscuous and spread AIDS all over America.
By the way, for people who have not read the book, this supposedly was a lone nut who spread AIDS all throughout.
Exactly.
I've termed him on my program in the past Lee Harvey AIDS.
Yes,
so.
well, it's a good term. But what happened is the media, picked up on this. Of course, by that time, the man was long dead. His name was Gaetan Dugas. But interestingly, and of course, I could never understand how the government had the time to follow this man around, checking on all the people that he was sleeping with in 1980. And around that time before AIDS was even known. But at any rate, it was interesting because when he was diagnosed in 1980 as one of the first AIDS cases, as I just said, 20% of the men in the hepatitis B vaccine experiment were already infected. So we can hardly blame, the poor little Canadian airline pilot, for introducing HIV into the gay population. Now, and of course, one of the things you'd really want to know is how many men from that experiment have died of AIDS, and you will never get that information, ever. It would be the first thing as a researcher that you would want to know. How many men died? It will never give you that information.
Now, when information of the type that you developed in your books began to come to light, pointing to the Hep B vaccine as the source of AIDS, a study came out by Dr. Poitz, which was badly skewered, indicating the opposite, and he has a very interesting involvement with these activities, Len.
Yes, absolutely. There's connections to Abbott Labs, which was the developers of the ELISA test and the blood screening tests that was used early on in the New York City Blood Bank. What's absolutely most amazing, and so obviously a distortion of scientific method, was that when the suspicions about the hepatitis B came forward and these alleged government top scientists were assigned to investigate these allegations scientifically, they neglected to study the New York group. It's astonishing that the group of people that specifically got this vaccine that's most implicated as having been the first people on the planet Earth to get the AIDS virus through the hepatitis B vaccine, they neglected to study them at all. They studied people, gay men, from Denver, Colorado. They studied a few from San Francisco. But all the New York men, they completely omitted. And that's exactly what Dr. Cantwell has just said. They will never give you the seroprevalence rates of these individuals or the death rates of these individuals.